About 8 months ago, we had had a series of break-ins in my apartment complex. I usually never have my door locked because, well, they're manual locks, and I just always seem to forget. Stupid, I know. Well, one day as I got home from work, I had saw a van that was parked next to me with its door wide open. A man had came down the sidewalk and then he said,
"Is this your van?"
I just kind of shook my head and told him I didn't know whose it was.
"Well, it's definitely not a good idea to leave your cars unlocked or open with what's been happening lately."
He then turned to walk away and just told me to stay safe. Fast forward to about 12 a.m. I had told our roommate that our dogs needed to go outside, so I'd be right back. I walked behind the apartment to where the doggy bag station was. Right across the yard, I could see a black figure standing underneath the streetlight. It was just staring at me. My dogs had started to growl a little bit and then just started eyeing him. As I turned to go back, the figure also turned. I walked around to the front when I then saw the figure up front as well, just a little bit closer this time. It was now that I was starting to get a little concerned. As I started walking toward my apartment, he did the same, walking in my direction. I stopped, he stopped. My neighbor came downstairs and headed to work. He told me to have a good night, and I told him the same. I used this conversation to make it upstairs and then run inside and lock the door. My roommate was still out for the night, so I just decided to sleep in the living room. I was watching TV when I then heard my front door handle start to be jiggled around. That's when my dog then started going insane with a lot of barking, and then suddenly, I then saw a black figure hurl jump down the stairs. It made such a loud thump that it actually shook the apartment. I watched him look around really quickly, and as he looked at my apartment, that's when I realized that it was the very same man who had asked me about the van previously. I constantly wonder what would have happened if I had not been in the living room when I was, or if my neighbor hadn't come down the stairs. It's really creepy to think about. At the time of this story, I was about 5 to 6 months pregnant. I worked at a car parts store. 9 years of my life has been working with car parts, and as a female, we meet some pretty creepy characters. If they didn't right out ask to speak to a man, they'd be trying to talk down to you because apparently women don't know mechanics. That's just the South for you. We had one regular customer that pretty much came in almost every day. He was a backyard mechanic. Now, if you don't know what that means, it just means that he would rig stuff and always overcharge for like the dumbest things. We called him Barefoot because, well, he always came in barefoot. I had spoken to this man many times and he always gave me really creepy vibes, like don't leave your kids alone around him kind of creepy. One day I answered the phone and it was him. He had called in to see if his part had came in. No problem. I put him on hold and then went to check. When I get back to tell him it was in, I picked up the phone and I then heard him talking to someone else. Not wanting to be rude, I just listened and waited for him to be done. That's when he then said something that made me want to vomit. He said that he couldn't wait to catch me alone so that he could get my number, and that he also had intentions of me orally pleasing him to completion. He said it in a really nasty way, but I'm sure you get the gist of it. I immediately hung up on him and told one of my bosses in case he called back and said something about being hung up on. But of course, at that point, nothing could really be done. Well, about 2 days later, he had came in right as I was walking out, and he then started to scream about how he liked my ass. At that point, I then turned around and went over to my boss over the last boss, but once again, they said nothing could be done. This sort of thing kind of happened a few more times. I once saw him actually creeping around my car, but since he didn't do anything, once again, there was nothing they could do. After about 3 weeks of him just catcalling and getting away with being crude, he then took it up a notch. One day he came in and walked straight to where I was and started asking about parts. As I start to look up what he needs, he grabs my hand and then whispers to me,
"Look, I don't care if you want it. I'm gonna screw you."
Now, it didn't immediately register to my mind what he had just said because, who says things like that? As soon as it sunk in what he said, I walked away to the back and absolutely refused to come out until he was gone. Now, they could do something about it, right? Nope. My district supervisor actually happened to be there that day, and I then explained to him what was going on with the guy. And his first question? Well, does he buy a lot around here? I honestly don't know why I never told my husband about any of this, but I felt like my place of employment was really failing me, and I was scared. About 2 days after that, I had went outside to my car because I forgot my name tag. Guess who was waiting for me right on the side of the building? Yep, barefoot. I barely saw him out of the corner of my eye before his hands were on me. He had yanked my arm so hard that I fell to the ground, and then he pounced. He had started to cover my mouth while then fondling my breasts. His face was inches from mine when he then spat out,
"I got you now."
I was very pregnant and really scared. All I could think of was trying not to freak out to the point that I went into premature labor. Right at that moment, I just knew that the worst was about to happen right in broad daylight. By the grace of whatever power you believe in, one of my coworkers was coming out for a smoke. She always went on the other side of the building to do her smoking, but for whatever reason, on that day she decided to switch it up, which I found out later that she was actually just checking on me because I was taking too long. She then screamed at him, and it was enough to get him to run off, hop into a car that he had parked right next to mine, and then pill out. I would really like to say that my place of employment was really great, and they sent me to the doctor to get checked out, but they didn't. They said that all they could do was just to tell the guy not to come back. I'm not ashamed to say that I actually cried for hours after this incident. But let's be honest, who wouldn't? I'm 21 years old now, but this happened to me when I was 17. I was in high school at the time, and I always walked to and from school. I didn't take the bus because, well, I was bullied a lot, so I didn't really have any other transportation. One day I was walking to school when this white van had pulled off to the side of me, and a guy that looked about his late 30s then rolled down his window, and then he asked,
"Hey, do you need a ride? I know that you're in the 11th grade and that you go to that school over there."
Now, I was really confused of how he knew where I went to school and especially what grade I was in. I told the man no thanks and just kept walking. After that, he never appeared again until next week coming back from school. It had started to rain, but not too much, so I still had a chance to get home and not be wet. As I was walking home once again, the same guy pulled over his van right next to me. And once again, he had asked if I needed a ride. I told him no thanks and just kept walking. As I was walking, I then heard a car door open, then slam shut. I had turned around and the guy was out of his vehicle and was starting to walk towards me. I couldn't really do anything other than just stare at him. Right at that moment, I heard an old neighbor of ours then say, "Oh hey Ashley, can you help me with something in the garden? Also, why didn't you show up at work yesterday?" I knew at that exact moment what he was doing, so I just started to walk to him. And with that, the guy got to his car and then left like nothing ever happened. I had thanked the old man for helping me out, and soon after, I arrived at my house. The next day, I actually saw in a news report that the guy had been arrested for attacking and stalking other teenage girls. I was in complete shock when I saw the guy in the photo. I immediately told my mom about it, but since the police had already caught the guy, we couldn't really do anything else. After all of that happened, my mom started to take me to school pretty much every day and always pick me up. I sometimes still wonder though, what would have happened if that old man wasn't there to possibly save my life? It's really scary to think about. I would like to share a really horrible experience that happened to me a couple of weeks ago. My name is Sagal, and I live in an urban area with lots of people on the same ethnic background as me. It's a relatively safe place aside from the street gangs that are slowly but surely starting to die down. To start off, me and my brother and father all live in this 2-bedroom apartment, which is kinda hard to access if you don't live there. There's multiple guards who secure the area since there are 6 different apartments in the entire premises ranging from 1 to 39 floors. The apartment doors are pretty heavy and hard to break down, and they're only accessible to people who have keys for them. My family and I always keep the door closed, and we put the chain in as an extra line of security. I reside in the tallest building. Anyways, I'm always home alone since my dad goes to work, and my brother's usually at my uncle's house for most of the day. About 2 weeks before this incident, I had noticed that there was this man who was always giving me eye contact and sometimes followed me close behind whenever I left to go home to buy things. Whenever we crossed paths, he would always tell me how pretty I am and how he would love to do inappropriate things to me if I was his girl. He would always follow me inside the apartments and wouldn't even press a floor until I asked him where he was headed. To which he always replied,
Oh, I'm going to that floor.
And always pressed the floor below mine. I got so irritated with him always following me every time I saw him, so I mustered up the courage to ask him why the hell he was following me all the time. He just told me that he wasn't, and some bullcrap excuse to get me off his back, but I didn't believe it. He kept on with it, and I just got tired of it, cursed him out, and told him that I was going to report it to the police if he didn't leave me alone. Well, he didn't really seem to like what I had said. He proceeded to look at me with pure anger in his eyes. Instead, I decided to report it to the guards, which I immensely regret still to this day, and always will. When I did report it to them, they said that they would take care of it. Anyways, fast forward to the day that this all took place. I had came home around 8 p.m. and my dad wasn't home, so I locked the door and I didn't put the chain on it because my dad was going to be coming home late. This was a really bad idea, seeing that I could have just stayed up until my dad came home and then unlocked it myself. It was only my older brother and myself. My dad had called me and let me know earlier that day that he wouldn't be home that night until around 1 a.m. I dozed off at around 12 a.m. and that's when I awoke to some kind of noise in my room. It was kind of like a shoe hitting the edge of an object. Now, I have a really extreme paranoia whenever it comes to dark spaces, so I kept my light on. The headboard of my bed has a light that's very dim, so I decided to keep that one on instead of my bright lamp. Like I was saying, I awoke to some noise that night and slowly started opening my eyes. I had a really huge blanket over my eyes and body, so I could only see a little bit. So, for example, if a person were standing a few feet away from me, they couldn't see that I had my eyes open. So when I did open my eyes, I could slightly see a figure in the corner of my room clear as day, and it was the man. It was that same man that was following me. I started to panic really bad, and my heart rate started to go up really fast. However, I decided to just act like I was asleep. I could make out the large object that he had in his hand to be a sledgehammer. The handle of it was about the same size as a ruler. I have a few drawers on the left and right side of my bed attached to the headboard, and I had a really small but sharp knife on the left side drawer, which at the time was facing my back and away from him, so he wasn't able to see it. The man started to creep over to me with the object in his right hand. He set it down on the larger drawer which was facing his back. He then proceeded to move my blanket from the lower side of my body and then started groping me. I was about to cry. I slowly but surely had moved over to the left side of the bed, acting as if I was still asleep and that my body was just adjusting itself. I guess he didn't want my body to be moving at all, because I saw that he started reaching for the hammer and probably thought that hitting me with it would just defuse the problem. He succeeded, because as I was scrambling out of my bed, he had actually managed to hit me right on the side of my temple with it. Right then, I immediately hit my back against the wall from all of the dizziness. I grabbed the knife and then shouted for my brother at the top of my lungs. He leapt across the bed and then charged at me yet again, but I clutched the knife harder and stabbed him between the area where his shoulder and neck met, which then led him to yell, and very loudly. My brother bursted into the room and then tackled him onto the floor and then started aggressively beating the life out of him. I proceeded to stumble towards him, grab the hammer, and then hit him on his head as hard as I could. He was out cold. I snatched my phone off the bed, called 911, and explained the whole ordeal while my brother had him pinned to the ground. Then I called the security guards, who then contained him while the police were on their way. Then I called my dad while crying and telling him what had happened. The cops had arrived minutes later and they arrested him. My dad came home right away and caught a glimpse of the man. He was returning back to consciousness and actually tried attacking him while then cursing and threatening him in our language. My brother literally had to pull my dad away from attacking the man. My dad came inside to find me curled up on the floor, crying uncontrollably. He started comforting me while holding my head to his chest to calm me down. After all of this happened, my dad took me to the hospital. They said that I would be fine though. The one thing about this that I'll never understand is how he even got through my front door, then my bedroom door so quietly, and then managed to shut it without a sound, as well as how my brother, who was awake at the time, didn't even hear him coming in. I always wonder if I hadn't awoke that night, what would have happened to me, and what would have happened if my brother wasn't there. I'm just really happy I never have to find out. Here's a little bit of backstory before I begin. So the story happened when I was around 22 years old. For perspective, I'm a female who had been in the same relationship for about 2 years. I had been in a secret relationship with my boss. He was much older than me and I was really starting to get bored of the relationship. He was around 37 years old and well, he didn't have much of a libido. Now, I'm a very adventurous and sexual person, and I started to realize that I wouldn't be happy staying with him since our love life had pretty much fallen right down the crapper. I still felt like I loved him, but I was always really curious on what I was missing out on. He often worked mornings and I worked nights, so there was only about a 2-hour overlap where I would see him at work. Other than that, he was almost always asleep by the time I got home. I had seriously started to lack the kind of love and affection that I would require to continue on with that relationship. I also really enjoyed going out to bars and socializing with people of all ages, especially since I was getting no type of excitement at home. Now, I've never told anyone about this experience because I know if any of my family knew about it, they would probably be pretty upset. My father is a sheriff, and I know that they would disapprove of my decisions. My mother has never been a fan of me going out to bars, and she's always warned me about not leaving with people that I didn't know. But since I was getting so bored with my life, I said screw it, and I just did what I wanted. I still think about this experience a lot, and it really makes me glad that I'm able to share my story to this day, knowing what all of the outcomes could have been. Now that all of that's out of the way, here's the story. One night after a really long shift, I went straight to a local bar to have a couple of beers and socialize. I oddly really love going to bars by myself for a lot of reasons, but mostly I just know how to take care of myself and I like making my own decisions on things. So I was sitting there at the bar by myself just drinking a beer and staring at my phone. I would almost always acquire company even if I went by myself. Being a young girl in my 20s with long blonde hair, and I was pretty friendly. So there I was by myself. The bar wasn't empty though. I noticed that there was some kind of company get-together mostly comprised of adult men right behind me, and they seemed to be drinking and having a good time. I didn't associate myself with the group and just sat there drinking and on my phone. All of a sudden, there was a rather large man, maybe in his 40s, sitting next to me and trying to start up a conversation. I wouldn't have considered him attractive, but I'm not the one to shoot down a conversation with a stranger just for that reason alone. He was asking me all of the basic usual questions, and he seemed friendly enough. He also had a friend with him that came up behind him and also engaged in conversation with us. This man looked a little younger and more attractive than the first man. All three of us conversed, and it was pretty obvious that they were involved with the company party happening behind me. I thought the men were nice, but I still tried to pick up on people's intentions and tried to keep that in mind. I just tried to keep that in mind. Both of the men tried to get me to leave with them. Even though I was flattered, I turned down their proposal, telling them that I was in a relationship and that I really wasn't interested in anything. They said it was okay and still talked to me. They then went on to tell me that they were actually at a hotel nearby and that if I was willing to go with them, they had dabs back at their hotel room that they were willing to share. I was very aware of the dangers and I denied them multiple times. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I'm a stoner chick and I love getting lit, but not with strangers so late at night while I was alone. They were really persistent though. Being the young, ignorant girl that I was, eventually I decided I would be adventurous and just try and go with them. That's when I told them that I was only interested in the dabs. I would go with them, but I wasn't going to be sleeping with either of them. They said that we were only going to do dabs, nothing more, and they seemed very excited that I caved and agreed to go with them. So we packed up all of our stuff and started leaving the bar. One of their coworkers actually tried to come running after us asking if he could tag along. Both of the men told him no and that he would have to stay. The man who was trying to come then became bitter and then yelled out after us as we left the bar.
Alright, but you better send me pictures.
Right then and there, all of a sudden, I got a really bad feeling. I felt a shiver up my spine and I could hear both of the men chuckling while walking with me. I then stated for a second time very clearly that I was not going to be sleeping with either of them, to which they both said they knew. I started to feel like I was making a really bad decision, but just continued on. I have no idea why. Maybe because I had already committed to going and I was already on the street with two very large men that I didn't know. We walked to the hotel and my feeling of discomfort started to swell up inside of me. We didn't say much while we walked. We made it to the hotel and stood in the elevator. 100 different thoughts then started to run through my mind. I had started to think about all of the different outcomes of how the situation was going to play out, and I started to panic, afraid of what would happen if I all of a sudden decided to run. We had walked down the hallways right toward their room and I noticed them glancing at each other. What am I doing? What am I thinking? Where are they going to find my body? All of these questions and even more running through my mind. I couldn't help but imagine going into their room and having it all be set up like an episode of Dexter or something. But when we arrived at the room, it was totally normal. The first guy sat at the desk and dug out a backpack from under the table, then started pulling out his dab equipment. But I had noticed the other guy seemed very fidgety. He stood next to one of the beds, just watching me. I'm not gonna lie, I felt incredibly uncomfortable. But being the quiet, soft-spoken person that I was, I stood there and said nothing. I decided to take a position next to the desk, leaning against the wall. I really can't remember either of their names, but for the sake of the story, let's call the man serving the dabs Jack and the more slender, sketchier one Frank. We were having a pretty normal conversation and I had already been given around 4 dabs and was feeling pretty high. I had started to notice that Frank was inching closer and closer to me, and that's when the content of our conversation then started to take a completely different turn. Jack seemed pretty laid back, just taking dabs, but Frank was getting closer and closer by the minute. They tried talking to me about my boyfriend. Now, I had no intention on cheating on him, and I've never cheated on any of my boyfriends throughout my whole life. I definitely wasn't going to start now. They had started asking me if I was happy, if I was bored, and what I liked to do sexually, and what they liked to do sexually. I was incredibly uncomfortable. Frank was all of a sudden right next to me with his arm leaning against the wall just inches above my head. I started stuttering and I couldn't think straight. I was afraid to tell him to back off in fear of creating an even more uncomfortable situation. My heart was pounding so fast that all I could think about was getting overpowered and then taken advantage of. I then started saying that I should probably go home now, and they both just started asking me questions about why I'm in such an unsatisfying relationship. All I could think about was how I was going to get out of this crazy situation. I can't really remember all of the different things that they made me talk about, but I was very unnerved. Jack could tell that I wasn't feeling good about things and ended up telling Frank to back off. Frank took a couple of steps back and then went silent for a few moments. Then Frank asked me if I wanted him to go down on me. Instantly, I felt absolutely infuriated. I said that I wanted to go home immediately. Jack stood up and then they both stared right at me. I knew that whatever was going to happen was about to happen, and I braced myself for anything. Jack then stood in front of the door and they both just looked at me. Jack then said,
"You can leave, but only if you tell us you don't want us to go down on you."
I felt my blood run cold and both of my hands then formed into fists, and I straightened my arms out at both sides. I felt like I almost yelled, and I think I startled the both of them. "Look, I don't want you to go down on me." Right after that, I made my way to the door. I walked over towards Jack, who was over 3 times my size, and stared him in the eye. I think then and there they both saw how serious and angry I was. Jack stood off to the side and he finally let me through the door. I was waiting for one of them to grab me, but it never happened. I was then outside the door and it closed behind me. I decided to run down that hotel hallway at probably about 2 in the morning. Besides standing in the elevator, I ran all the way to my car, jumped inside of it, drove home, fighting back tears along the way. I snuck into my house and walked into my bedroom. My boyfriend passed out in bed. I laid down next to him and pretty much just laid there for hours, just staring at my ceiling with wide eyes. I never told my boyfriend about my experience. The story deeply affected me because I can't help but thinking that because of my decisions to do something dumb and have a good time, I put myself in apparent danger, and I've always been very careful ever since. This story is for anyone who thinks that nothing bad can happen to them, and even though this story could have turned out differently, that thought has been the downfall for many people, and I won't soon forget. Please everyone, just be careful. Okay, so when I was about 15 years old, I used to go for walks on a path that was going around this really small lake with my dad. We would walk for exercise and to spend time together. Once I turned 16, my dad had started working nights, so he wasn't able to go on our evening walks. I started going with one of my friends named Carla. She told me that there was a park by our house that we could walk at. I figured that a change of scenery would be really cool, even if it was on the tougher side of town. The park was nice. It had lots of big trees and had forests going all around it. I would park my car at her house and we would walk to the park together. One day while we were walking, Carla got a call from her sister saying she needed to get home because they were about to leave. We said our goodbyes and I decided to go around the track just one more time. While I was walking, I saw one of those vans that didn't have any windows on the back half of it. You know, like the kind that you think about when you think of the stereotypical kidnapper van with the sliding door. That one. Well, it then pulls up right next to me. The passenger was a woman and she was asking me for directions back to the highway. Still standing on the track, I gave her the directions. She apologized, saying she couldn't hear me and asked if I could come a little closer to the van. Nope, I wasn't about to do that. I've watched Criminal Minds lately. I'm totally not falling for that. Still standing on the back track, I just began yelling the directions to her once again. She had then stared at me with a really wide-eyed blank stare before telling me thank you and slowly driving off. I felt a little creeped out but just continued walking. The walk went pretty uneventful for a while until I got to the edge of the side where the forest ended. There was a parking lot and that same van was now there. I could see the woman looking at me and the driver was a man. I presume he was looking at me as well, but he had sunglasses on, so I couldn't really tell. I looked a little bit harder, and that's when I noticed that there was someone in the back of the van. Nope. I ran across the park all the way back to my friend's house without ever looking back. My friend and her family were still gone, so I got in my car and took off. When I drove past the park, the van was gone. I honestly don't know if they were really just a lost family or something far worse, but I'm just really glad I never found out.